During the Legends of Equestria open server weekend in late July, I spent a lot of time playing. Too much time, in fact. I've been sitting on well over 20 hours of footage from that weekend that, frankly, I've largely avoided going through and editing. It's been about 2 years since I posted a review of LOE, and for the most part, my views remain the same. However, there have been a few important changes since that time that I wanted to address. This video won't be a full review, but instead a follow-up review focusing mostly on the things that have changed since that time. Over the past 2 years, the biggest improvement in my opinion has been the game controls. 2 years ago, I was incredibly frustrated by the implementation of mouse look. Now, the controls seem to be much more fluid, and the frustration I felt previously is almost completely gone. I say almost because strafing still doesn't work as expected. That is, rather than moving laterally, strafing makes your character move in a sort of wide arc while panning the camera in the same direction. I honestly can't think of a single instance where I found this functionality to be useful. And in combat, it's especially bad since it makes you lose vision of your enemies. Aside from that, I felt as though I had much tighter control over my character's movements. And one non-brony who I introduced to the game even commented that although he dislikes MLP, he enjoyed flying around as a Pegasus specifically because of the flight controls. My biggest disappointment was that the chat system remained essentially unchanged. I had mentioned 2 years ago that the multi-tab system makes communication more difficult, and I still believe that to be the case. Flipping between tabs was incredibly annoying, and I eventually settled into one tab and stopped reading other channels altogether. The solution to this, which I also mentioned 2 years ago, is incredibly simple. A single output window for all channels, color-coded by text, optionally filterable, with a drop-down to select which channel you're speaking into. I'm very curious why the chat system has remained unchanged, because it seems like this would be such an easy improvement that would have a positive impact on the entire game. That is, do the developers think that it's good enough? Do they think it's perfect? Or are they simply too lazy to change it? When I last played the game, I mentioned that I quickly gave up on quests for various reasons. This time, I was determined to experience all that the game had to offer, and before I bothered testing out the combat system, I spent a full 8 hours talking to every NPC in the game and completing all of the quests to the best of my ability. Most quests involve talking to certain NPCs in a specific order, and to my surprise, the dialogue generally held my interest. The few that didn't hold my interest were the quests that had me talking to the same few ponies over and over, as well as one quest which literally involved reading through a countless number of text windows from a single pony. For these, I just couldn't be bothered to read through the entirety of the text. And even while skipping text, one quest took me well over an hour to complete thanks to the constant backtracking which was required. Even though it took ages to complete quests, I appreciated that quests provide experience, so I didn't feel like it was all a waste of time, and if I recall correctly, by the time I had completed all of the quests that I could, I had leveled into the mid-20s. The quest tracker was a nice addition, and the in-game and on-map quest indicators were incredibly useful when they worked. I no longer felt completely lost trying to find random ponies the way I did 2 years ago. There were a handful of instances where the indicators sent me to the wrong location or failed to appear, but in most cases I still managed to complete these quests, and there were only a couple of cases where I had to consult the extensive game wiki to figure out what to do next. A few minor bugs in the dialogue trees did prevent me from completing 2 quests, but overall I was surprisingly satisfied with the quest system. Nicely done. Since the last time I played, the most significant map additions were the Crystal Empire and Everfree Forest. The Crystal Empire in particular looked very impressive, but was unfortunately somewhat barren. I assume that as more quests are added, that issue will be resolved. The Everfree Forest had a nice atmosphere, but I found the linearity with regard to monster types to be a bit off-putting. As before, being a Pegasus gave a huge advantage since I could fly over any encounters that I didn't want to fight. The only real limitation was the addition of a stamina system, which makes sense from a balance perspective, but in many ways detracts from the game experience, especially when so much of the game involves running or flying back and forth between far too distant NPCs. The changes to the combat system I was less impressed with. Previously, combat was very fast-paced. Players did a lot of damage, as did enemies, so combat typically lasted less than a minute and gave LOE the high-stakes feel of an action RPG. Now, fighting enemies is a button-mashing slog. As before, there are certain enemies that are unable to hurt you for whatever reason, and I spent a good amount of time testing out all of the abilities available to me on these enemies. On the surface, the number of abilities seems impressive, but from a practical standpoint, many of them don't work at all, and most of those that do are less useful than the basic attacks that you start with. New abilities are unlocked through a point-based proficiency system. In principle, this sounds like a great idea, but the implementation seems highly flawed. I assumed going into it that such a system would give me a finite number of points and force me to specialize my character, but instead, I had enough points to max everything available to me. Some abilities are unavailable depending on your race, but within the game, there's no real indication of which ones are unavailable or why. I also assumed that the cost per proficiency point would increase with level as a means of forcing specialization, but that wasn't the case. Instead, I was able to cap out every ability each time a new proficiency cap was unlocked. My biggest complaint with the combat system was, oddly enough, with the hotbar. Abilities and emotes are accessed and used via the hotbar, and since I had so many useless abilities, being able to reorganize abilities is very important. However, the current system for reorganizing the hotbar is not only unintuitive, but also incredibly tedious. I had to spam the global chat for several minutes just to figure out how to do it, since it turned out that the vast majority of players had no idea themselves. What was worse, after I reorganized the damn thing, reloading the game reset the hotbar back to the way it was before I spent what seemed like an eternity reorganizing it. I was very frustrated by this, and after making a few attempts to solo kite a dragon from full health, I decided I'd had enough of the combat system. The last thing I want to talk about is in-game moderation, which is incredibly lacking. The first and most glaring problem is that moderation is based on the forums, which means that if you can bypass the forum security, you can make it into the game. As such, even the simplest browser proxies are sufficient to bypass any IP ban. Second, there's no restriction on pony names, and multiple players can have the same pony name. I'm sure some people think this is fine. I mean, how else are you going to have 15 Twilight Sparkleses in the game? From a more practical standpoint, it means that anyone can log in pretending to be anyone else. Case in point, I invited a few trolls into the game to test out these security flaws, and they managed to get at least one player banned and another player kicked from the game by simply mimicking the user and pony names of actual players before spamming the chat with obscenities. Overall, I had a good time during the open server weekend, but the incredibly slow rate of new developments and the changes to the combat system now leave me somewhat skeptical when it comes to the direction of LoE. As before, the best part of the game is without a doubt the game environment. And also as before, I would urge developers to proceed in a more directed way, rather than an apparent shotgun approach which is getting them nowhere fast. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.